Welcome back. Today we're going to take a quick look at the KBEAR Rosefinch. So the Rosefinch is another one that's, I guess, in the same series of songbirds as Lark. So Lark from a year or two ago had a very, very similar metal faceplate. Again, another super nice build, and just had a different design cut into it. So this one has lines cut into it, and I think Lark was square. So again, these are very nice builds, and this one was about $20. I don't think Lark was $20. I think that was actually more expensive. So it is quite nice to get such a nice build at a $20 price. So very nice there. So this is what the stock tip looks like. And if we look at the other set that I have here, this is actually one of the newer. This is the TRI Clarion wideboard tips, and this is the stock tip. So you can kind of see, either this is comically small or this is comically large, and this one I think is actually comically large. This is, kind of a standard stock tip, but the Clarion is a very, very wide bore set. And why that makes a difference with Rosefinch, and we'll get to that in 1 second after this. I show you the really stock cable. You've probably seen this one before if you've looked at any other KBEAR sets. It's actually their kind of stock cable at this price, so nothing too special with that. So why I mentioned the tips and the wide bore or small bore is they kind of give you a small bore tip, and those tend to emphasize bass, and then they give you a signature where Rosefinch is in the blue, and that is a lot of bass. There's sort of no doubt that this set was really designed for bass heads, people who like a ton of bass, and to give you smaller bore tips that are going to really emphasize that. It was kind of surprising, but I tried it both ways, and I was actually curious. I was actually more curious about these Clarion to see how they would do with so much bass. Would they cut it all the way back or just partially? And they kind of do a pretty reasonable job, but if you find yourself, you ordered the Rosefinch by mistake and you didn't realize it was a bass headset and you needed something to make it sound a lot less bassy, then the TRI Clarions will actually do that almost there. But when we look at the signature here, there's sort of no doubt what's happening here. This is all the bass straight up into the mids. There's a tiny bit of mids here, and then Rosefinch is the blue line. So it sort of arcs off at about Harmon here, which doesn't quite balance out the amount of bass here. So this sounds a little darkish from here, and that's the coupler, but they didn't really bump it as much as they did on Ink. So Ink was their prior. It's a little bit more expensive set with a little nicer shell, but it had just a little bit less bass, but a bigger V shape. So if you wanted, a little more treble with this much bass, then Ink was probably going to be more for you. Whereas Ink or as Rosefinch is pretty much a straight bass head, no fatigue level here, just lots and lots of bass and a little bit of mid there. So let's kind of quickly walk through this. So as I said, this is not a delicate songbird. This is not Lark. This is not a delicate, wispy songbird style set. This is a big, heavy, slightly dark bass headset. There's no, you can't wave your hands over the graph and say this one isn't really a heavy bass head. It sounds different than a graphs. No, it sounds exactly like it graphs. But as I said, the price is right. The build is actually very nice. This is actually a very, very nice looking $20 set. So I think they did nail that price. Anything a little bit more, and I think people will get overly critical about the driver and the bass quality and all those other things that we'll get into in 1 second. So the bass, as I said, it's got big quantity. That is a big bass shelf. And this one definitely goes quantity over quality. It's not actually all that tight or fast. It's just kind of slower, slightly bloated, kind of jello-y. It's just got this soft, big amount of bass, and slower, softer, a lot more sub bass than mid bass slam. For those of you who are bass heads who really like to hear dynamic drivers hit really hard, that is not this one. This one is definitely more of a sub bass rumble, just a lot of bass quantity. So make sure that this is your type of bass head bass. The mids, they're kind of okay. I mean, you kind of look at the graph and say the mids are going to be what they are. There's no magic there. Either you bump them up a lot like Ink did to make them quite audible over this amount of bass, or you leave it kind of low like this and they kind of just rise above the bass, and it kind of struggles to get there, but it's okay for this tuning. But the bass is very distracting. You can't really escape the bass. Anytime you have bass in your track, it's going to basically swallow up your mids, and they're okay, but the bass itself is just very, very distracting. And as you're trying to listen to vocals, you'll start hearing these bass sounds that you never heard before. Like, when you read reviews or watch videos and people say, this set is so detailed, I start hearing things that I haven't heard before. That's exactly what happens with this much bass. When you amplify, when you boost, bass this high on this driver, which is an okay at best driver, you start to hear weird things in the bass. And this one is boosted so high that, I just started hearing some weird things in the bass that I've never heard before in certain tracks. And, that is clearly not intentional, but it became so distracting that I sort of wrote that there. But they're forward enough, so it's not audible above. It's forward enough, so it is audible above the bass, and enough to sound reasonable. But you're really not going to be buying Rosefinch for the mids. You're basically only buying this for bass, and do keep that in mind. So the treble, very much like the mids, and they kind of roll off the treble a little bit, so it's a little bit darker. But the level is just enough to rise above the bass, but it really struggles. It struggles pretty hard on this set. You'll hear treble for a little bit, and then it'll get swallowed up by the bass, and then it kind of comes back. It almost sounds grainy the way it kind of comes in and out, but it's not really grainy. But the way it's sort of inconsistent and not quite as solid as it should be, it's just being swallowed up. But if you like treble, as I said, if you like a little more treble with your bass, then look at Ink, because Ink definitely lets this whole upper range sit at a higher level to balance out the amount of bass they did, whereas I would call Rosefinch a pretty classic bass headset where tons and tons of bass, and then you sort of keep this very low and reasonable, so there's no fatigue, nothing to distract you from the meat of it, and that is the bass. So the stage, again, this tuning is just not heading in the direction of big stage. That much bass through the mids is just not going to give you the clarity, the upper frequencies, the psychoacoustics, whatever you call it. None of this tuning was heading in the direction of a big stage, and it's pretty much centered right between your ears and quite flat. There's just nothing going on there to even move you in a direction of a better stage. So again, that sort of impacts everything else here, and it's sort of why the mids are just okay. If everything was a little bigger and more spread out, it would probably sound better. But again, this is bass headset. If that's your thing, then Rosefinch is for you. You're probably not going to be debating between Songnode 0 and Rosefinch. They're from two different planets. This one is planet bass, so very, very much make sure that that's what you are looking for when you're buying Rosefinch. And that's what I got on Rosefinch. So again, thank you guys for tuning in, and we'll see you next time.